Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the World Affairs Council Upstate, America and the World Conversations Lectures. Today, we're about to talk about a very important and very sensitive issue, the global cry for racial justice. World Affairs Councils all over our nation work hard to bring you in a very nonpartisan, non-political format the current events and global impact issues that affect us worldwide and most specifically here at home. It is in that spirit that we try to provide you the most fact-based academic information we can and keep our minds open and broad to all viewpoints. If you have questions today, please type them into the chat. They will be given to our speakers by our moderator in order to keep the speaking event moving forward easily. I want to also remind you that today's event is just a part of an ongoing effort to engage in global education across our region. The upstate of South Carolina is a very, very internationally focused business area, and we work today to bring all of this engagement in a way that goes out to our students, goes out to our residents, goes out to the internationals who call the upstate home. If you're not a part of our organization, please think about joining us. Your funding and your donations help keep these events available to everyone. With that, I'd like to introduce our chair of the World Affairs Council Upstate, Mr. Rob Rowan, who will introduce our guest speakers. Rob?
Welcome everybody, good afternoon. I have three incredible people that I'm going to be introducing, and I will tell you what, their bios are pretty interesting, and it's a little bit of work to read through them, so bear with me, but I think you'll see why that you can't cut too much of this. And I'm glad that you're all here supporting us today. So hopefully in the future we will be doing this live again. Well, Chris Richardson is a former U.S. diplomat and prominent immigration attorney and the co-founder of the world's leading remote video immigration consulting technology company, Argo Visa, LLC. He served in Nigeria, Nicaragua, Pakistan, and Spain as a consular officer. And throughout his time in the Foreign Service, he managed hundreds of officers and local staff in some of the most dangerous postings in the world. He also investigated several high-profile fraud rings, including at least two that involved members of the U.S. missions abroad. More critically, he managed post-responses to crisis situations, including terrorist attacks, plane crashes, violent national unrest, bombings, rapes, murders, kidnappings, and hundreds of death cases involving Americans who died abroad. For his service, he won several awards for this, and he resigned in protest from this consular service due to the President Trump's Muslim ban and the president's derogatory statements about African countries. Immediately upon resigning, he drafted an affidavit against the Muslim ban, which was cited by the Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer in Trump versus Hawaii. He's been featured in Mother Jones, Slate Magazine, Reuters, NPR, Embedded, All Things Considered, SCOTUS Blog, BBC, Georgia Public Radio, Intercept, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and has been interviewed by the New York Times, CNN, and CBS. He has written opinion columns for the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle, Slate Magazine, Chicago Sun-Times, The Hill, and The Nation, all regarding immigration policy and the issue of diversity at the State Department. So he is well written, and imagine here he is in our community. What a gift. He's a graduate of Duke University School of Law and the co-author of Historical Dictionary of the Civil Rights Movement, and lectured at the American Civil Rights Movement at universities and colleges across the globe. Currently the General Counsel and CEO of BDV Solutions, LLC, an immigration consulting firm. And that's just our first speaker. Todd Shaw has been on the faculty of USC, University of South Carolina, since 2003. And he was appointed the College of Arts and Science Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies. He researches and teaches broadly in the areas of African American politics, urban politics, and public policy, as well as citizen activism and social movements. Shaw's current research agenda explores the political, sociological, and ideological ramification of changes in the late 20th century and early 21st century, on the African American community. His book, Now is the Time, Detroit Black Politics and Grassroots Activism, published by Duke University, explores the dynamics between Black grassroots housing activism and the responsiveness of Black elected officials in Detroit and other sister cities. This book received the W.B. Du Bois Best Book Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. As an author and editor, Shaw has also published in a number of scholarly journals and is working on a fourth book project, exploring how differing social and community spaces, neighborhoods, civic and social groups, as well as social media, provide different incentives for African Americans to foment group solidarity and social ties, and in turn, civically and politically participate in the local democracy in the city of Atlanta and across the U.S. So I'll tell you what, two amazing people that are presenting today. And along with that, we have our moderator from Furman University, Brittany Arsiniega, is assistant professor of politics and international affairs at Furman, and her interest in law and society, especially the study of policing and immigration, was followed by attaining a dual JD and PhD in jurisprudence and social policy from the University of California, Berkeley. So she practices law in California and South Carolina and supervises student interns in the Justicia Project. This is a legal clinical program providing legal assistance on a variety of social justice related issues. And when she's not working at Furman, she practices law with Weiss PA and volunteers as a member of the Hispanic Alliance legal team. So you can see we have quite a group of interesting and well-versed people to talk about this. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Brittany and Chris and Todd, and I hope you enjoy this. Thank you so much for coming.
We're going to start with some brief comments from Dr. Shaw. Dr. Shaw, would you feel free to start screen sharing now?
The hue and cry of 2020-21 is you're muted. I had to unmute myself. Okay, sorry, I go to my presentation. And I was given the charge to speak very briefly, and I will. And so thank you very much to the World Affairs Council of the Upstate for inviting me today. I'm delighted to be part of this this conversation. I wanted to just, and I'll also give a shout out, I have enough titles, but I also wanted to highlight this fact. I would be in trouble with my dean if I didn't, that I'm the interim dean for diversity, equity, inclusion on the College of Arts and Sciences at UofSC. So wanted to likewise talk of that connection. I wanted to talk about sort of the global impact of the Black Lives Matter movement. As we all can attest, that part of our discussions about racial justice are animated by that movement that occurred in, that movement that began in 2013 with an important collaboration between three African-American women, Colores, Tometi, and Garza, that they began the Black Lives Matter hashtag as a result of the Trayvon Martin shooting in Florida by George Zimmerman, that then has mushroomed into a national and global movement around questions of racial justice. I'm showing you here three pictures in the context of that global movement. The upper, the picture at the top is right here from Columbia, South Carolina, and activists including Nathaniel Lawrence, who have begun those efforts. And this was around July 20 of 2020, you know, where the activists were marching to the local police station. Then I'm showing you here a picture from Leeds, Britain, and the activists there holding their first rally, and then Abuja on the African continent and Nigeria. I'll circle back around, but part of the reason why I'm showing you 3 pictures connected to Black Lives Matter is to say that Black Lives Matter is part of an ongoing tradition, and its impact is part of an ongoing tradition that some would say are rooted in a notion of Pan-Africanism. And I use the notion of Pan-Africanism in the sense that it is not just rooted alone in the idea of being of African descent, but is connected to all those who are allies with that movement as well. A little bit, just for a few minutes, I'm going to talk about how I, as an academic, have approached these questions of social movements, and then speak to just this broad possible impact. In some ways, there are, you say, well, this scholar talks about local politics, urban politics in Detroit, in Atlanta, and elsewhere. And so what does he think are the global impacts? Well, giving a shameless plug here to my book on Detroit, I attempted to talk about when is Black activism effective? And so I use sort of the global literature on social movements to speak about effective activism occurring within a particular context, and when protest is the right tool at the right time in the right place, as I frame it in that book. And I have a general sort of sense that from the social movements literature, that movements that movement framing and collective identity is always important. In what ways do activists sort of borrow broad frames like Black Lives Matter and use those frames, and in other words, create sort of a shared identity, whether one is Black or not, because the Black Lives Matter movement that in mobilization that occurred this spring was very multiracial. And so sort of that broad sort of framing that occurs that matters to movement, and then the ways in which movements share networks and can have sort of information sharing, and the fact that one movement precedes another in sequencing. I'll also give a shout out to a colleague by the name of Sekou Franklin, who's at Middle Tennessee State University, because he also talked about in his work the similar aspects that I talked about of the framing of movements. And the fact that in his case, he's talking about sort of the emergence of the Black youth movement in the United States. And clearly Black Lives Matter is part of an ongoing aspect. It's not simply Black youth, but Black youth energy and Black young adult energy is clearly animating aspects of this movement. Having said that, the impact we can unpack, but let me just sort of talk about the emergence, or not so much the emergence, but the sort of high points of this movement in the spring, particularly when you had this New York Times article that came out July 3rd that said Black Lives Matter may be the largest movement in US history. And so when they looked across sort of various random sample or national surveys done by statistically random samples, whether it be the Kaiser Family Foundation, the Civics Analytics, the National Research Center, a Public Opinion Survey, or the Pew Center, they found sort of from 10% to 6% of all respondents said they had participated in some protest, in the Black Lives Matter protest. That could, if you took that 10% and sort of imputed what that means more broadly, that could have means as many as 26 million Americans to 15 million Americans between the early June to mid or later June participated in these protest efforts. So that's one sort of way in which just the size of the movement itself here in the United States was clearly quite large. Then if you look across the way the movement was dispersed across communities, and so percentages of the population that had counties that had higher percentages of white Americans in each of these counties. If you look at these sort of smattering of counties, there was some would suggest that as many as 800 cities and hamlets across the United States participated in had some Black Lives Matter protests. And they weren't all in sort of large urban centers or metropolitan areas that were more predominantly of color. They were in smaller cities across this nation. And so this map is sort of mapping out the percentage of population that is white in counties that had protests. So again, this idea that it was quite widespread. And there was clearly also ways in which this protest had a direct impact of shifting of public opinion. So in the last 2 weeks, American voters' support for the Black Lives Matter movement increased almost as much as it had in the preceding 2 years. So you went from a solid don't support to support over the course of that period of this summer, late spring into the summer months of 2020 with a 25% increase, whereas it was underwater previously in terms of support. So what of the global impact? And we'll unpack a bit more, how from Nigeria to France to Atlanta, Georgia, we saw these Black Lives Matter protests in solidarity with each other. One indication of sort of at least the global spread was sort of Twitter and Instagram posts that were flagged hashtag George Floyd from May 29th to June 8th, 2020. And conceivably, at least some 60 countries saw protests, in every continent except Antarctica saw these Black Lives Matter protests. And you can sort of see these concentrations certainly in the United States, but again, clearly in Europe, clearly in West and East Africa, clearly in India, and certainly in parts of the Southeast with these hashtags, if you will. And then if you looked at just one day, June the 20th, 2020, of the sort of reported news stories around protests, likewise, the sort of worldwide protests. Certainly we have the highest concentration in the United States, but just from one day, we saw sort of, protests in Nigeria, protests in at least parts of South America and Central America, and protests in nations such as Australia. Now, that's not to say that you haven't also seen a decline. And so support for the Black Lives Matter protest has gone down since September. At least sort of 12 points according to a Pew Center survey among all adults from between September and June, sort of the most precipitous decline among whites, but some decline among Hispanic or Latinx populations and Asian American populations, although still strong support among African Americans. What this means in the broader context, we can unpack. And so thank you for now, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaw. And please, if you have any questions on what he's presented so far, feel free to send them along in the chat. But for now, we're going to turn over to Mr. Chris Richardson. Please go ahead and you don't have any slides, I believe, right?
No slides. Okay. No slides. Thank you guys, and thanks everybody. I was going to do this with a cat thing, like the cat lawyer, just to see how cool that would be. But it's really nice to see everybody. It's really nice to be here. Thanks to Upstate International. Thanks to the World Affairs Council for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. I think that when we're thinking about this idea of a global cry for justice for African Americans here in the United States, it can't be divorced, much like American foreign policy, from this idea of global justice for people, period. I think that when you look at the protests that happen globally, in France right now, there's a huge, there have been hundreds of protests, not just about George Floyd, but also about police brutality in their own countries. There were protests in Belgium, not just about George Floyd, but also King Leopold II and their own role in colonialism. There were protests in London against statues there. There have been protests in Rio de Janeiro, Sydney, Monrovia, Kenya, Israel had protests. And these protests initially coalesced around the idea of what was going on in America. But then people stepped back and thought, well, what's going on in my country? And I think that that is the power of George Floyd. It isn't that it just made people think about the lives of Black people in the United States, but it made them think about the lives of Black people in their own countries, and also about the lives of other people in their own countries. The idea that a police officer could be so casual in putting his knee to the neck of a man, you know, it really shocked people viscerally. And it shocked people viscerally because of things that go on in their own countries, and also how oblivious their leaders are to those things. And so right now in France, the president, Emmanuel Macron, is saying that, well, these ideas of Black Lives Matter and these ideas of racial equality are poisonous to French society. He says that it's poisonous. And he's saying that because he says that it's taking away from French society. And when I lived in Europe, I heard this all the time, where people were like, well, America has racism, but us in Spain, us in France, us in the UK, us in Belgium, we don't have racism. And it's so funny because then when I would talk to Black people in these countries, they would have the exact opposite reaction. And so it really makes them question what they're saying as well. So like, for example, in the Netherlands and in Belgium, they have something called Black Pete, which every Christmas, around Christmas time, they have somebody who dresses in blackface. In Spain as well, they have people who dress in blackface, and they go out and they do these Christmas celebrations, and they have these cartoonish attitudes, and they say yet again, but we're not racist though. And so George Floyd has made these people, white people all across the world, ask tough questions about their own role in history. Who built these roads? Who built these things, right? So here in America, the US Capitol that was just raided was built by slaves. The White House that had a president, several former presidents, that was built by slaves. Wall Street was built by slaves. Harvard was supported by slaves. Everything that you think about American power, these things were built by slaves. They were built by Black people. And so it's not just that these lives matter, it's also like what made it so these lives didn't matter. And I think that that has been the question that globally people have been forced to ask. And in many ways, the pandemic has been, you know, beneficial in that way, in that it's made the world sit down and think and look at, this is what you're doing. It's made America and the world be like, there's no more football, there's no more sports, there's no distractions. You have to sit here and think about your role in history and think about how you got to this place where a police officer could casually put his neck on the knee of a man without any kind of repercussions. And so in unpacking that as well, and I hope we can talk about as well, is not just, you know, the role of authority in these other countries and the role of racism in these other countries, but also how America's diplomacy interacts with those other countries, right? And so at the State Department, when George Floyd was killed, the embassy in Seoul tried to put up a flag, a Black Lives Matter flag, and it was promptly ordered to take it down. Now President Biden is wanting to focus on these diversity issues at the State Department and how America's relationship with the rest of the world is. You know, it's interesting that in the United States, we publish a human rights report on every country in the world except our own. We sit there and we tell China, we tell Russia, we tell Belgium, we tell everybody, these are your problems, this is what you got to do. But we don't publish such a thing about our own country. And I think that those are the kind of questions that we are now asking ourselves is, how do we as Americans interact with the rest of the world? How do we speak to Belgians? How do we speak to people in Belgium? How do we speak to people in London? How do we speak to people across the world who are dealing with their own police brutality, who are dealing with their own issues, but are also dealing with their issues with us and the role that we've played as a global power in perpetuating things that have gone on to harm other people, but also how we as a world, how as a country, we project ourselves to other people. The United States prides itself on being the land of freedom and the land of justice and the land that other countries should model themselves after. But it's very, very hard for those other countries to model themselves after us when they see the way we treat our own people. So in the 1940s and 50s, when we first saw the end of colonialism and we saw countries gaining their independence, ambassadors would come to the United States from Ghana, they would come from these other countries, and they couldn't go to restrooms. They couldn't go to bars, they couldn't go to hotels. So in New York and in Washington, D.C., when the first Black ambassadors came, where those ambassadors ate were at the residences of other Black ambassadors, because there were no eating places or facilities for them in this country. And so imagine the hypocrisy of it, that these people who came here to be diplomats didn't have any rights, because we felt that way. And in large part, the United States changed its global, it tried to change its issues on segregation and racism because of this very fact, that we're trying to, quote unquote, sell ourselves to the rest of the country. We're trying to defeat communism by showing ourselves as being a brighter beacon. And yet we would involve ourselves in allowing for segregation. And within the State Department itself, the best way to think about, which is the arm of US diplomacy, when you're trying to think about, well, how did the State Department look at these issues, or how did the State Department deal with racism and race, the best thing to remember is that so when the State Department first professionalized, so to become a US diplomat, you have to take a Foreign Service exam, and that exam requires a written exam and an oral exam. So when the first Foreign Service exam came out and the first Black man passed it, Clifton Wharton Jr., the State Department was so horrified that this man passed this exam that they went to the President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, and asked him to write an executive order barring Black people, women, and naturalized Americans from being US diplomats. That is how unwelcome Black diplomats were when we first started professionalizing the Foreign Service. And so it's interesting that in that time, so when the President said no, he wouldn't do that, what the State Department did said was fine, we will bar Black people by using the oral exam and keep them out. And they did that for 25 years. So after Clifton Wharton passed, there would not be another Black diplomat for another 25 years. And so when you have a system of diplomacy that's built on that kind of animus toward women and Black people, you don't get over that stuff overnight. And even in the 1950s, when the first Black diplomats were complaining about the fact that they had to eat in a segregated cafeteria, the State Department's answer was to partition the cafeteria into a segregated part and an unsegregated part. So if you wanted to eat with the Black officers as a white person, you could, but if you wanted to maintain segregation, you could do that too. And so you have a system that for 70 years, maybe about 50 or 60 years at our State Department, in our diplomacy, that advocated essentially for white supremacy, that advocated for this idea of sexism, of keeping people out that were different. You don't overcome that overnight. And so I think when you're thinking about this global cry for justice and freedom and questioning, I think that the United States itself has to ask tough questions about its role in police brutality. But two, other countries have to ask themselves the tough questions and not just be in solidarity with us, but also ask the questions. You know, it's one thing to be in solidarity with me, you know, here in Charleston, South Carolina, but if you're a Belgian and you are allowing police to beat up your Black Belgians, you might want to be in solidarity with them and asking yourself those tough questions. And then the third question that I think this is making us ask as a country is our relationship with all these other countries. How the United States exports this idea of, you know, being this beacon of democracy and hope, but how do we have an honest conversation with these countries, not only about their own problems, but about our problems, and also how those problems have been historical, that this stuff didn't just pop up overnight. Many Black people in the United States didn't feel at the time when George Floyd was killed that it was that big a deal, because we've seen this all of our lives. I have seen police and African-American men killed all my life. And so what makes it different this time is that, you know, I guess it was caught on video and it became global. But I think that that's been the big thing. And so that's been the blessing and the curse of all this, is it's really made our country and our world have a global cry of understanding.
Thank you so much. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, and so I'll start with one. Someone asked about the US's position as a global leader of how people are treated or should be treated equally, and asked whether there is another country that in the world is now in that position. So two questions here. The first, do you think it's true that the US actually ever had claim to, you know, that American exceptionalism claim to really being the beacon of freedom and democracy? Is that a true thing that used to exist and no longer does? And do you think that there is a country that has taken, if that's true, is there a country that has now kind of taken that flame as the world's current beacon of how to treat people equally?
Oh, please, Professor.
Well, no, likewise, attorney, I think I'll start there, or I'll start an answer, but as you just did in your presentation, feel free to fill in all the details. So, no, I would argue that American exceptionalism has always been a myth in some regard. Exceptionalism in the sense that it's this sense of how we as Americans in our political culture or values will do things differently. And although we will observe sort of broad democratic and sometimes egalitarian principles, but that we are that sort of, sort of city on the hill, that exception, if you will. Now, what is the myth? The myth is that, very much coming on Mr. Richardson's comments, the myth is that some of these ideals within the context of the United States were transported from our origins and our colonial beginnings. I talk a lot about in my course on the Introduction to Racial and Ethnic Politics in the United States that some of these ideals with regards to race and racism stem in part from from English or Anglo-American views on race. And so the idea that you will come up with this idea, this view of separating individuals or segregating individuals. There's a book by George Richardson that talks about the ways in which the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and the anti-segregation civil rights movement here in the United States had direct linkages because they were both arguing over or fundamentally challenging racial segregation as a policy. The apartheid there looking very similar to the apartheid here. And so in some ways, no, I think that exceptionalism, now it doesn't speak to American military and political power and the global position of the United States, which certainly has emerged in the 20th century. But I think that sometimes that myth has meant, as Attorney Richardson referenced earlier, that myth has meant that in some ways, when Gurner Myrdal in his important study and actually his important study on American democracy in the 1940s, a lot of which, what Gurner Myrdal wrote was also supported by the scholarship of Black scholars such as Ralph Bunche. But Gurner Myrdal sort of said there is this sort of gap between Americans' views. It's testament to democratic values and inequality and what it actually does. Well, it is true that some of that debate around the Brown v. Board of Education and the Supreme Court sort of deciding around the overturning separate but equal was very much pitted upon Cold War politics. What do we look like if in fact we say we are this democratic beacon and yet permit the South in the North tacitly to continue to observe racial segregation? So at the very least, there's been this push and pull and tug in the United States with regards to that gap between the democratic ideal and the outcome. But exceptionalism, we're not quite as exceptional as the myth would suggest. And I'll leave the second question about where it is now. If in fact the myth doesn't apply to us, does it apply anywhere else?
Yeah, I would add that I think that we as a country, when I worked as a diplomat, people would often ask me that question about, well, you guys did this, you guys did that, America did this, America did that. Like, you guys aren't, like, this is something that the world knows. Like, the world knows we're not perfect at all. In fact, like, it's fascinating to me that I found people in foreign countries had a better understanding of American politics and American race relations than our own diplomats did. That I felt that people were much more nuanced and understanding about, and actually knew who Sandra Bland was. They knew these things going on in America. And you had a lot of white diplomats who had no idea about those things. And so, but at the end of the day, look, great-great-great-great-grandfather fought in the American Civil War for the Union to make this country a better place. I've had family members in almost every single war and every single protest movement. We've been protesting in this country and fighting against this country since we first got here. We've been fighting, you know. And so, for me, I always go back to this idea that yes, I do think that we are an exceptional country. We don't always live up to that exceptionalism, but at least we fight and we try and we continue, right? And so, when people ask me, you know, well, this is the country of Robert E. Lee and the racist, I say that is true, but we're also the country of Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln, Ralph Bunche, and a lot of great people. And I think that those people are the examples that we need to look for and look at. You know, when people ask me, you know, what about said president, and what about this racist leader, that racist leader? I say, you know, look to the more shining beacons of examples that the United States has. You know, the fact that, you know, in France, for example, they tut America. They say, America, you know, you guys are such a racist country, blah, blah, blah. But in many ways, as a country, we have thought and fought and analyzed these issues far more than other countries. A lot of countries have not come that far with thinking about this stuff. And so that's why in Spain and in Belgium and in the Netherlands, you can have a person in blackface, but in America, that's going to make you lose your job. You know, like we as a country, you know, on race, we are very far behind, but we've also evolved ourselves. And even the notion of a black president in some of these places would just be unheard of. And so, and black leaders and black power in that way. And so I do think that while as a country, we do have a long way to go, I still believe us to be a country that other countries can look to and emulate, at the very least in how we do have a lot of solidarity. And even thinking about like African Americans, I did a talk about the civil rights movement, and someone had asked me, well, you know, is the civil rights movement really about pitting white against black? And I was like, no, because blacks only make up 13% of the US population. We couldn't win that war, even if we tried. No, the reason why the civil rights movement was successful was obviously because of black people, but also because of white people who risked their lives, white people who are out there protesting every day for something that doesn't affect them. When you think about the housewife from Michigan, Viola LaZuzu, who traveled from Michigan to Selma to march because she saw people marching in Selma on television and lost her life doing that. When you think about James Robb, when you think about some of the ministers and people who were killed, you know, who didn't have to do that, or even to the extent Martin Luther King came from a very prominent and wealthy family. If he had chose to, he probably could have lived a very comfortable life. And so I think that in that way, the United States is an example of how ordinary people have always done really extraordinary things, that ordinary people look at these things happening in our country and say, that's not going to be done in my name. And I think that that's something that I have always respected and admired about our country.
Chris, can I just sort of push back, but say that really doesn't speak to American exceptionalism as much as uniqueness, right?
True.
So in that regard, I mean, there's the unique and distinct particular American history, and particularly you've made the point very well about the way in which social movements have taken effect here. And particularly sort of those who are aligned with Black social movements and racial justice. So anyway.
I've got another question for you. You know, Chris, what you just said is the idea that in the United States, ordinary people can fight to make a difference. What would you say to people that say, well, then how are the folks at the Capitol insurrection on January 6th, aren't they just ordinary people trying to make a difference? And, you know, how can we distinguish between the folks who participated in the Capitol insurrection and folks who support Black Lives Matter? You know, there are some that believe that Black Lives Matter is a violent, right, is a violent protest group. So what would you say to people that try to compare those two groups?
Oh my God. So
this is in the chat. I'm just doing my job as moderator.
Yeah. So, well, look, I think that this speaks to the duality in the United States, in that you will always have a protest movement for social justice and change, but you will always have a backlash against said movement. And I think the Capitol is a perfect example of that. So a good example is after the Civil War, we had a period for 10 brief years during Reconstruction where we actually experimented with biracial coalitions to elect governments in the South that actually, and like most of the educational systems in the South, and particularly in South Carolina, are basically based on the laws that were passed by those Reconstruction governments. And when you have that kind of biracial coalition that threatens both economic power and racial power, there's going to be an inevitable backlash against those things. And so I think that America is very much a country of two steps back and two steps forward and one step back. And that there's always going to be these people who are angry and viscerally angry about losing something, and they can't quite put it into words what they're losing, but they're losing their authority and their place in the world. And you know, it's fascinating watching these people raid this US Capitol that was built by slaves, that was built by Black hands, that was being guarded by Black people, and how little disregard they had for police authority. After having spent 4 years basically being told that Blue Lives Matter and that the police were important, the minute that police power was threatening them and their whiteness and their abilities or whatever they're protesting, they instantly threw that out the window, as if though I guess none of that stuff really mattered. And so I think that, and if you ask me like, well, how do we know which side is the right one or the wrong one? I don't know that, right? But I mean, how do you convey that to people who are like adamantly one way or the other? The only way I usually convey it is I say, well, let's look back at the civil rights movement in the 1960s. When the civil rights movement was going on in the 1960s, Martin Luther King had a 65% disapproval rate. The March on Washington had a 75% disapproval rate. Most of the actual civil rights movement was not popular, right? Like the Black Lives Matter movement was far more popular than the civil rights movement in its time. And yet, if you ask white people today who lived in that period, did you support segregation? Did you support Bull Connor? They're like, no. Oh no, I always supported MLK. I always support it. Martin Luther King has like a 98% approval rating right now. And so I think that unfortunately in that way, history always, I do believe that in terms of social justice, it takes time for people to see the wrongness of their ways. And I think that that's going to be true in this era as well, where a lot of people are making a lot of stands and they're going to pretend like they never made those stands later on. And just to give one more example of that, in the 1960 election was one of the closest elections. It was split 50-50. 2 years later, there was a poll of Americans asking, who'd you vote for? And 70% of them said Kennedy. And it's like, well, some of y'all must be lying, because Kennedy almost didn't win. And that's the same thing with the civil rights movement, where like everybody supported civil rights, but it's like, well, some of y'all must have supported segregation, because otherwise there would have been no need for a civil rights movement. And so I suspect that in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, the people that have these horrible ideas about a lot of this stuff, or people who look at this movement with conflict or look at it as something bad, might have a change of heart, largely because people like Professor Shaw and others are holding them to account, and that eventually they're going to come back but they'll never admit they were wrong. What they'll say is that, I always supported Colin Kaepernick, I always supported Black Lives Matter, oh, I always supported that stuff. And a perfect example is that of Muhammad Ali. When he died, everyone was like, oh my God, what a great American, what a great hero. People on both sides of the political spectrum were saying that. But when the man was what he's actually famous for, he was hated for. 80% of Americans opposed that. And so I think that unfortunately time will tell is like the ultimate answer to a lot of these questions.
I would also add to that excellent set of comments that I think it was the New York Times, but don't quote me. Either the New York Times or the Washington Post did reported an analysis of the Black Lives Matter protest, because it's an often cited statistic, and they just sort of mapped out, and you can do this now in this sort of social media age, right? It's literally mapped where protests are, which is one of the maps I showed you in terms of the world context. And they found that 97% of all these protests involved no violence at all. And so that's one thing. It's sort of 97% of Black Lives Matter protests, at least documented to be nonviolent. And so that 7%, percentage did involve some property or personal injury or sort of property injury. Compare that to the context, just objectively speaking, of the Capitol insurrection, with five individuals dead, the sort of multiple injuries. In fact, I think there was a recent analysis that demonstrated I saw the Washington Post story that said 27 or so of the individuals involved and arrested were police officers or in law enforcement themselves, which is interesting. So just on, but on the sort of pure angle of sort of the violence, there's that comparison. And then I think you always have to say, what's the target and objective of protest? And no, sort of in Washington State, the destruction of property was, sort of, there were strong voices on various sides sort of being concerned about, the federal courthouse that was cordoned off, sort of the property destruction that happened there. But it was around this question of racial justice and unfairness, and sort of fundamental sort of police violence against African Americans. That's a different question, I think, in my view, than stating that an election that had been certified, at least by 60 courts in the Electoral College, was in fact a fraudulent election, and using that as a basis to stop a constitutional certification process. So, I just leave it to your voters, to your audiences, to reach their own conclusion, of course. But the objectives of those protests are very different. And so the objective of a protest and the level of violence or non-violence might be some indications about whether or not there's sort of equivalence, and more broadly, moral equivalence between them.
Thank you. We've got another couple of questions in the chat about what the recent demonstrations and insurrection at the Capitol mean for our democracy more generally. So one attendee asked or noted that human nature, or humans by nature, classify things into groups, right? Sports teams, flags, colors, and this person notes that in a lot of ways, democracy and democratic governance is no different. And do these, knowing that human nature is to form groups, have these demonstrations made folks who are critical of democracy, have they in some way proved to them, hey, we're right, democracy doesn't work because look at the sort of infighting that happens?
I guess I'll answer that one, or attempt to. No, so on the Capitol riots, I think the first thing we have to do is look at that in the context of, and we've talked about this, but in the context of just American history and how this isn't the first, it's the first raid on the Capitol, but I mean, when you look at how America has treated Black people its entire history, and even state governments, the government of Wilmington was overthrown by whites. A lot of state governments in the South during Reconstruction were violently overthrown, and lots of Black lawmakers and legislators were killed throughout the South. When you look at just how lynchings occurred up until the 1940s with just indifference, and this carnival-like atmosphere. When you put America in that kind of context of how people have put white supremacy before democracy since America became a country, then the Capitol riots don't seem all that shocking. In terms of what it speaks to of America and its place in America, yeah, of course people will be able to use that as an example. But the problem is that you can't really point to any country that doesn't have these issues with the way it treats people. It's one thing, I mean, it's kind of weird for China or Russia or anybody to tell us oh yeah, democracy doesn't work because you guys are having police violence when the entire state are run by authoritarians who exercise far worse police violence than anything we could ever dream of, And so, but I do think though that the way we need to distinguish ourselves as a country is to be honest. I think that the problem with our diplomacy is that we think of ourselves as a PR firm less than as an actual country talking to adults, okay? So it's good to go to these other countries and be like, yes, these are all the ways in which we as a country has failed. This Capitol thing was crazy. We have treated our Black people this way. And these are the things that we are doing to amend those things. And now what are you doing, China? What are you doing, France? What are you doing, Spain? In the same light. And I think in that way, we can have an honest conversation with these other countries. But no question that, just talking to my I'm the former diplomat, but talking to other diplomats, the Capitol riot took a huge hit on, it had a huge impact on our perception in other countries. But I think that COVID-19 itself probably had a greater impact just in how we handled it and how America just seemed helpless and powerless and indifferent to a virus that killed 400,000 people. That probably had more of an impact, but I think that this just added to that perception that America is going through a spell. But I do think, though, that, again, we have to look at the Capitol riots in the context of white backlash, and how white backlash is as old as social democracy and social movements in the United States. And that I think there was a question there about where do we go in the next 5 years. And I think that that's going to be the big question, is how big the white backlash is going to be and what other things are we going to see between now and then.
Yeah, and picking up on that, I think along with that notion of white backlash, I think the sense that there's a difference between a grievance-led populism versus sort of democratic, sort of grassroots mobilization rooted in the rights for grievance and free speech, right? And so, and in fact, this is my own view, I'll share it, that if in fact you're talking about a mobilization that was rooted in an untruth, the election was stolen, that was then sort of projected by the former president of the United States, and that led to a fundamental challenge to a democratic system, that's not really a good rebuttal to say democracy doesn't work. In fact, that didn't speak to democratic processes, because in fact, if challenges had been successful, it's been often stated that, let's just take again to Mr. Richardson's point, if challenges had been successful in various states, that would have meant at the very least throwing out millions of African American along with other votes. And so so if in fact challenges to, senators who make calls and presidents who make calls to officials in Georgia had overturned, 12,000 votes, then those electoral votes would not have gone, and I'm not saying they were all African-American, but African-Americans were solidly voting Democratic in the state of Georgia as elsewhere. So again, democracy would suggest from Reconstruction to now, sort of the ability to have an expanded franchise means that you don't make false claims, that you do have to have things rooted in truth. It is more authoritarian politics that are rooted in untruths and rooted in the notion that, when the system does not work, then we want to appeal more to central figures rather than the law. So it's not a good rebuttal. That's all I would say.
Right. And and I'll just add really quickly that, again, and I know I made this point before, but it's really worth emphasizing that white supremacy always comes before democracy. That has been the history of the United States since day one. And a perfect example is right here in South Carolina. After the American Civil War, 60 to 65% of the population of South Carolina was Black. That is just the truth. 60% of the population was Black. And had those Black people all been given their right to vote back then South Carolina would have likely had a Black governor, a Black senator, et cetera, et cetera. And what they did was they created this myth around corruption. They're like, oh, well, these Black people are corrupt. They cannot be trusted with democracy. And that gave them the license to use all manner of violence. And not only did they use the violence to overthrow the coalition, the biracial coalition here in South Carolina, then they built statues everywhere. They erased the names of these Black legislators and leaders from history. They built statues everywhere in honor of this stuff. And so that's why John C. Calhoun's statue in Charleston, that wasn't made until the 1890s. And the reason was because they wanted these Black people to know, this is your place, that we are going to, everyone talks about cancel culture and cancel history. That was the very first and the real cancel culture in history, essentially erasing Black leadership, not only from their positions, but just from history, period. So the first Black lieutenant governor in South Carolina ended up being a street sweeper after his term was over. They basically made all these Black leaders that ran South Carolina and wrote your education policies and did all these things. They made all these Black leaders irrelevant and they erased them from history. And so I think that when we're thinking about democracy versus, other things, that's always going to be the issue, is that if people really feel threatened, if power is threatened, democracy will always come second to that. And that's been the silent truth of the United States for far too long.
Thank you. We have someone who wrote a comment, but I would like to turn this into a question. So someone wrote that they have always seen American exceptionalism as a sign of insecurity, and that in their view, transparency and honesty, as you, Chris, noted, is the better way forward. So my question is, what ideas do you have, or have you read in the literature about how we move forward from this myth of American exceptionalism, in which the reality is that white supremacy comes before democracy, to a reality where Americans can honestly look in the mirror and self-evaluate? What needs to happen for that to be possible?
No, Professor Shaw, you first.
Hey, the question quoted you. Well, so I mean, I think just sort of extending upon some of our previous comments, the one thing I will say, and when we think to this, or think from lessons that historians have tried to glean from this, and often historians will say that, well, no, it's not that history repeats itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And so the question we might ask, is this a rhyming moment in American history? Have we seen this before? Is this similar to the period after Reconstruction that was sometimes referred to as white redemption, or in some of the literature referred to as white redemption, of sort of, is this a period, I mean, given that we now have these overwhelming is the wrong word, we've had greatly increased levels of voter mobilization, particularly in the early 21st century here. We've outstripped certainly most of the at least since 1960, the turnout that we've seen in presidential elections, and now that has effectively been reversed. And those who are concerned about this sense that, well, if in fact you have a greater franchise, then in fact we will see this redound to the benefit of only one political party. Well, quite frankly, there's one analysis that demonstrated, given our electoral system, that 100,000 votes could have changed the outcome of the election in some key ways, the presidential election, and could have changed, Congress quite a bit as well, in terms of, and so we are still a fairly evenly divided nation electorally, even though, of course, Biden won, by 7 million votes, roughly speaking. So, I mean, I think the argument is still to press forward and to double down on democracy. That if we're going to kind of really get to a point where, double down of democracy and introspection and self-critique. That, again, if you're really sort of talking about democratic ideals beyond American exceptionalism, if you're saying that there are ways in which we share these ideals in a global community, and that we can take our example of what we've learned around these questions of race, of racism, of white supremacy, and say, and not lecture France, but to argue in the French, to have an honest discussion in the French context, to say, color blindness is not going to didn't serve us well. I don't know how diplomats could frame this, hasn't served us well, and I don't think it will serve you well either. Even if you're fundamentally concerned in the French context about sort of the rise of ethno-nationalism, of religious fundamentalism, et cetera. And so how does the American example with regards to, well, but if you let democratic, if the state recognizes that there are these inequalities, that you can't simply gloss over them and say, well, the way in which we deal with racism is that we do not recognize aspects of race. That is not a great prescription in any context to actually sort of deal with these inequalities. And so not so much American exceptionalism, but American lessons. But we've got to first learn those lessons ourselves before we can begin to preach to others and transport them elsewhere.
Yeah, and I would only add to the professor's excellent comments that I think that if we are looking for a different way, it has to be a radically different foreign policy. And what I mean by that is, one, that we can't divorce foreign from domestic policy. I just finished a book by George Packer on the life of Richard Holbrooke. That book was 800 pages about a diplomat who served for 40 years in the State Department, and you would not even think there were Black people who lived in America. There were no Black people in his entire book. How do you go as the top diplomat in the United States and you live for that long and not have a single Black person, well, one Black person, Susan Rice, who we did not like, come across, right? How do you have that kind of thing? And I read the books of other former secretaries of state through it in the 50s and 60s, and you would think that there was no civil rights movement. You would think that it's like when Martin Luther King talked about how people slept through a revolution. Our entire foreign policy apparatus slept through the American Revolution of the 60s and the 50s. And so if we want to have a difference, one, that's the first step, is we can't separate domestic from foreign policy, and that we have to have a radically honest foreign policy, just as we need to have a radically honest domestic policy. And that means that the Foreign Service and our diplomatic structures have to have different voices in them. When I was a diplomat, in most of the countries I served, I was the only Black diplomat in these countries, the only Black male diplomat in these countries. And that means that basically there are people talking about America that don't necessarily represent all the views of America. When we're speaking with a voice that is one way, but the actual person is another, that does not speak to being radically honest. And I think that that's the second thing we have to focus on, is how do we have that radically honest diplomacy that's being represented by the fullness of the United States. And then the third thing is that we have to be comfortable with failure and setbacks. I think that a lot of people who are involved in social justice become very leery, heartbroken by the fact that justice doesn't come fast, it doesn't come easy, and it doesn't come cheap. And I think that that's what we have to focus on. But also, and fourth and finally, is that so Martin Luther King's famous letter from a Birmingham jail talks about this idea of the white moderate. And I think that you have a lot of moderate people who are more in love with justice, or more in love with order than justice, rather. That they would rather we just go along to get along, and that we find a way to just muddle through. And I think that the days of muddling through have to be over. I think that each of us in our own way has to be willing to speak truth to power, whether it be in government or outside of government. And that when we hear and see things that are wrong, that we actually have to speak up and do something about them. And I think that that is the only way. Like, I can't control what happens on the Capitol. I can't control what happens in the White House, but I can control what happens in my own life, and I can control what people say to me. And so we actually have to take it upon ourselves to try to educate people, in any way that we can. And I think that those are going to have to be the four things that we as Americans look to do as we look at how to move forward from George Floyd.
To follow up with one thing you said, Chris, which is that the people in our embassies and our offices abroad don't necessarily represent the diversity of our country. Someone in the chat asked about whether you think that we could solve problems by putting more Black people in positions of power. Or if that were to happen, would Black politicians do the same thing that Trump did, which is use false narratives to abuse power, try to stay in power? So do you think that putting people in positions of power is enough, or do you think that the power will corrupt? Seems to be, I hope that I'm getting to the heart of that question.
Yeah, I would just say that, just really quickly, that I think that positions don't mean nothing without power. And that I personally, it's like that old Nina Simone song, you don't have to live next to me, I don't want to marry you, I just want to have equality. And that's just basically what it is. Give me a position, give me the authority that you would give another white person, and that is all I ask for as a Black person. Because I think that what we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement is that a lot of it has been, I would call, Martin Luther Kingized. And what I mean by that is that it's been whitewashed into this thing where So Jamie Dion, of the head of Chase Bank or whatever, is kneeling in front of like, is kneeling on Wall Street, you know, being like, oh, Black Lives Matter. And it's like, and he's still evicting Black people from houses, right? So it's like, you can keep the kente cloth, you can keep the kneeling, you can keep all that stuff. Keep it all. Just make sure that I don't get evicted unjustly. Give me positions of authority, give me positions of power as a Black person that you would give to a white person, and we're cool. That's what I think about as equality. You know, people like, oh my God, I've seen so many hashtags. It's like hashtag diplomacy and hashtag living, where so many people are just so devoted to the idea that, well, you know, I'm speaking truth to power, but I'm not actually going to do anything about it. You know, speaking about it is one thing, but show me what you're worth. Show me what you're doing. Don't just talk about, you know, how Black Lives Matter. What are you doing to show that Black Lives Matter? And who are you putting in positions of power and giving them the same powers and understanding that you would give to white people? I think that that's more of an answer than anything else that can be provided now.
And I would say that, well, say this directly, that whether one, irrespective of someone's racial or ethnic identity, if they are harboring certain views and acting in certain ways, then the American public ought to hold them accountable. Having said, and toward that end, I think there's a dialogue and continues to be a dialogue among Black Lives Matter activists that are really kind of part of a broader civil rights, Black power, radical tradition that says, listen, electing Black elected officials to office is not enough. And there's a couple of layers real quickly about that, because some of my own work deals with this. One of the first layers is it an actual meaningful vote? If in fact we're talking about, and this is, you know, in the sense of we have a 2020 census that just occurred. There are going to be legislative districts drawn. If those legislative districts are ways that effectively disenfranchise people of color and other groups, you know, packing African Americans and Latinos into districts where, okay, we'll elect, like here in South Carolina, we'll elect one individual to Congress, but there is no other prospect that the other individuals who are Democratic and or Black or of color will be elected to Congress, because we packed them all into one district. So that's the first thing, is sort of meaningful electoral reform. But then the other thing is sort of having that ability to elect candidates who can speak truth to power, very much as Mr. Richardson is saying. And so in some regards, social movements are always necessary to hold people accountable and to hold them and to make sure they're honest. You know, we've seen this in the Republican Party, we've seen this in the Democratic Party most recently. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren on one side means that you know, pushes sort of Joe Biden and other progressives and Black and white more moderates or less, or not quite as on the left, you know, toward you know, certain policy views. So you need accountability and democracy at all levels, and particularly when we ask these questions relative to African American interest.
One attendee is asking whether you fear or whether you think that, whether you're concerned that racial justice movements might just be co-opted by white politicians who want to use racial justice movements for their own interests. And this attendee cites certain things like seeing Black Lives Matter trending only during election years, and the media paying a lot of attention to the death of unarmed Black men at the hands of police during election years, and then not paying attention in the, you know, after the election is over. Is that a concern that you have, that the movement is just being co-opted by powerful white politicians?
You know, I think that that's always a, yeah, I mean, I just mentioned about how Jamie Dimon, you know, president of Chase, you know, kneeled down there, and you had a bunch of white politicians, I'm not going to name them, who wore kente cloth on the Capitol and kneeled as well. And, And again, I think that you're always going to have people who are going to co-opt the popular movement. And again, like the people in the civil rights movement would have been so jealous at how popular the Black Lives Matter movement is. But you're always going to have people who are going to co-opt that stuff, right? I mean, like Strom Thurmond supported MLK Day in the 1980s, and it's like, why is that guy supporting Strom? Why is he supporting? I mean, I guess you should be glad that he's at least trying. I guess that's the way to think of it. But I think that you're always going to have people who are going to co-opt stuff for their own advantage. I think the key is, though, is trying to make sure that you take as much advantage of that situation as possible. That I don't want people to get into an idea that they're going to change human nature and that they are somehow going to transcend that. I think, again, it comes down to, can we get people in enough positions of actual authority and power to make a difference and a change? And also recognizing that, you know, again, I don't want us to think about this in terms of like, well, white versus black, because there are a few black people I can think of who are not in the interest of black people as a whole. And you have a lot of white Americans and people of different races who are risking their lives every day for black people, you know. And so if given the choice between, man, I don't want to name any names, but there are a few, there's some black sisters in North Carolina and a very famous black woman I'm thinking of right now, who I would absolutely not trust them to be the people that I would want to represent black people as a whole, if there's such a thing as representing us as a whole, because we all have very, very different diverse sense of views. But, and so, you know, if a white so I guess my conclusion is, if a white politician is going to take advantage of this, fine. I get that. That's politics. But I'm going to make sure that I'm going to get as much juice out of that orange or that lemon as possible. That I'm going to be like, yeah, you can take advantage of it, but you're going to have to like actually pay for that advantage somehow. It just can't be the Kente cloth. You're going to have to do something a little bit more than just that.
And every movement, including the civil rights movement, that is an effective movement, seeks some level of institutionalizing the movement in terms of actual policy outcomes, right? From establishing civil rights divisions within the federal government, to the passage, you know, in the 1950, 1960 civil rights movement case, to, you know, the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. And you needed, very much to Mr. Richardson's point, you needed white allies, white politicians who saw it in their self-interest. Let's be real, that there were electoral interests in the Democratic Party moving as it did under Lyndon Johnson. So seeing it in their interest to create a new coalition and to effectively support the certain outcomes based on that movement. I hope that the Black Lives Matter movement is not co-opted at all, but I do hope that there are actual real policy gains, because that would be fundamentally frustrating to the young people and the many other allies who were out there on those streets risking life and limb during COVID to stand, and often there were police officers at times standing in solidarity with them for real change. So I think, so if we don't see these changes, there will be electoral outcomes. There people may be deflated and say, well, wait a minute, after Black Lives Matter and this sort of change in administrations, and we still don't see police reform at certain levels, then what was it for? So co-optation, yes, that's always a concern. But moving the needle and seeing real credible outcomes, and we've seen some, and even cultural change. I once had someone who said and I see a comment here that was making reference to Malcolm X. I once had someone say to me, it's sort of a side lament. It says, could Malcolm X have imagined himself one day being on a US postage stamp, which happened, right? So at some point, all sort of heroes and sheroes who persist and are part of real fundamental change or cultural and social change risk even their image, because they have no impact when they are gone, risk becoming a bit too mainstream even for their taste during their lives. But the real lasting impact is how that inspires social and political mobilization again and again. So if the needle's not moved far enough, after this wave of the movement, what comes next?
Dr. Shaw, you used the word reform, police reform in response to the Black Lives Matter movement and protests. One attendee is asking, though, about essentially the difference between reforming, right, or changing the structure of the building when the foundation seems like it's crumbling. So if the foundation of this country is racial oppression and slavery, are these sort of amendments or rehabbing the walls of the country, is that enough at this point?
A very fair question. The activist scholar Angela Davis said, be careful, I'm paraphrasing her, be careful exactly what you're asking to be equal to. So equality, but equality relative to what? Or in the framework that the audience member is asking, yes. If we're talking about that, we haven't yet gotten to the fundamental inequality, the fundamental racism, the fundamental white supremacy, that aspects of the American political structure are based upon, then are you really making change? I think that's why, so I agree. I think that's why activists are asking questions that they say, it's not just about police reform. It's about racial justice. It's about the entire, sort of criminal justice system. It's about the wealth inequalities. It's about, sort of, if you go back to the original activists of Colores, Tometi, and Garza, they said it's about intersectional oppressions. It's about the oppression of Black trans women, as well as it's about poverty. So in a real sense, the movement itself recognizes the transformation, not just the reform that has to occur. What I speak of is the ways in which that transformation, it pushes in ways that it ultimately moves us forward, but recognizes or has a frustration to say we haven't moved far enough. And so, so I use the word reform advisedly. I would agree. If you're talking about this, if you're talking about activists being satisfied, I suspect they won't be satisfied with with just some reforms around the immunity of police. But at the same time, I think any reform that happens, and I'll use the word directly, wouldn't have happened if they didn't mobilize. So there is this creative tension between, yes, the actual transformation that needs to come about is over here. What activists get sometimes is shorter than that. And so thus the reason to continue to move, in some ways this speaks to this notion of the American experiment. It's always an unfinished experiment, in the eloquent words of Amanda Gorman. It's unfinished. And so there's always some need for further pushing to bring about really what is needed for that fundamental transformation.
Yep, you know what, I agree with that, and I'm going to move on because I really agree. I think that America is just an unfinished place, but I also don't want us, or those of us who feel very much that America has all these issues, to divorce it from the fact that the Black experience is very much American, right? That, again, African Americans built this country. All the things that we love about America were built on slavery and by slaves and by our ancestors. And that the continual, perpetual movement of America is because, in many ways, Black people have been the conscience of America. And so this isn't, so when people are like, go back to your country, this country, that country, and I'm like, no, my family's been in this country since the 1700s. My family has been here longer than yours probably. So I'm not going nowhere. This is my country just as much, if not more, than it's these racist country.
And Chris, this next question is for you. An attendee notes that she spent some time herself living in Nigeria and wanted to know if you could recall from your time there any similar social justice movements happening there, or maybe in other places that you've lived, but particularly Nigeria.
Yeah, so when I lived in Nicaragua, there were protests on the eastern side because predominantly on the eastern side of Nicaragua it's predominantly Africans and Black people, people of color, and they usually protested against the people from Managua on the western side, and they really felt that they were second-class citizens. So I saw that. In Nigeria, you have so many different conflicts of different types of people, depending on where they live, and you have the North versus the South, you have the people of the East versus the West. So Nigeria had lots of different movements. And when I was there, actually, there was a movement against they tried to raise the gas tax, and there were huge protests. In fact, we couldn't even go to work because they were so huge. But I think in Nigeria, you have seen a few protests about George Floyd, the same in Kenya. And that's predominantly because police brutality is everywhere, or a sense that you are a second-class citizen and that people are given this authority and they abuse that authority. And so even in predominantly Black countries, you still see people protesting, not just in solidarity with George Floyd, but also with this idea that you can have, whether it be the military or any powerful force that can trample over other forces. And interestingly, you know, I don't know if it's been said much, but I actually compare this to the Arab Spring in a lot of ways. That this is just a continuation of what happened during the Arab Spring. Because remember, the way the Arab Spring happened was because a police officer, you know, brutalized and embarrassed this young man in Tunisia in a shop. And that's where the Arab Spring really came about, was a protest against this kind of authority, blatant authority being used against poor people. And in many ways, George Floyd is just a continuation of a revolution that we saw with the Arab Spring.
There's a question someone asked earlier that I think would be appropriate to turn to now. How can we place Black Lives Matter in the context of these larger, you know, sort of larger global conflicts between both, you know, Blacks and whites in other countries, but also between different ethnic groups? Does Black Lives Matter consciously, you know, anchor itself in this sort of global fight for justice between ethnic groups and interethnic strife?
Well, again, I'll go back to the founders of the hashtag, who are sort of the founders of the movement, of those three women, one of whom, at least one, if not two, if I'm not mistaken, has immigrant ancestry outside of the United States. And so in some ways we can't, we can layer these things as the diversity within sort of the African diaspora as here in the United States. And I mean that in the sense of not, you know, just sort of Black people rooted in Africa, but, you know, black people Black people directly native from Africa, but also individuals of Afro-Cuban ancestry, Afro-Venezuelan, Afro-Colombian ancestry, et cetera. I would argue that in some ways that's the useful window to think about is the ways, you know, and this goes back to Mr. Richardson's point, the sort of the pushback against police sanction against those who are marginalized, or police violence against those who are marginalized. Yes, that can apply in many other contexts. And I would say it's not just ethnic conflict per se. Ethnic conflict suggests sort of a sort of grassroots conflict rooted in cultural differences or perceived cultural differences. This is really the conflict between those who are the dominant power and control in the state or in the police apparatus against communities who should be considered citizens but are treated otherwise. I think, and you can think of many instances where that is true. You know, on all continents where that is true. And even if it's not the perceived notion that we are different, there are ways in which, if you forgive me for putting it this way, individuals are racialized. They are made to feel as though they are a different race, which is a lens very similar to here in the United States. So I'm giving this sort of a sense that Black Lives Matter isn't about ethnic conflict, Black and white. It's about the use of police power and state power by a dominant group or perceived dominant group against marginalized populations of citizens. That's how I would define it. And that particular lesson can be applied in South Africa, in aspects of Beijing, you know, in Tokyo, I mean, wherever you go.
And you know, I think that is so the key of it, and that is what this movement, I think, is based in. And I would add that I think that the other big aspect of it is that when you look at what's going on in the world, but also when you're looking at Black Lives Matter, again, I go back to this point of so many different people trying to stand up for people who are marginalized. And I think that that is the lesson, not just of this movement, but of all movements, and certainly the American Civil Rights Movement, where you had people that weren't directly or affected by this, but felt passionate enough about it to actually do something. And if you ask me, like, how are we going to solve all of these ethnic strifes and all these ethnic conflicts in the world? It's only when people who are the majority or who benefit from a system actually rebel against that system. When the people who are the beneficiaries, when their children are the ones marching to overthrow that system, that's when you're going to see people and their ideas start to change. And so when white people march for Black people, when Jews march for Muslims, and vice versa, then that's what we're going to see. Because I think ultimately, like, look, I'm not going to try to get too political, but you know, one of the reasons I quit the State Department was because of the Muslim ban. And when I quit, you know, an officer, a diplomat asked me, they're like, well, why do you care? You're not Muslim. And I said, I am Muslim in that way. You know, I'm Muslim, I'm Christian, I'm Jewish, I'm everything, you know, like, and if injustice is happening to anybody in my name as an American and as a human being, then I have an obligation to stand up and try to do something about it. And I think that until we march for people who aren't us, and until we take tough stance for people that aren't us, that we're always going to have these problems. It can't just be that Black Lives Matter just to Black people. It has to be Black Lives Matter to everybody, just like Muslim lives matter, or any of the oppressed group, you know, it matters. And so I think, one, like the professor said, we have to talk about just the use of authority and power to abuse marginalized people. But two, what are we in any of our ways as a part of a majority, using our privilege as part of that majority to help those who are not in that privileged position, whether it be rich and poor, Black or white, Muslim or whatever.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaw. Thank you so much, Mr. Richardson. We are coming to the end of our time. So just in closing, the World Affairs Council Upstate thanks all of you for being with us, especially over Zoom. I know we're all fatigued by Zoom. So thanks for being here and participating in today's event. The next online event is of this America and the World's Conversation series is on March 23rd at 12 p.m. noon. And that will involve a discussion of the United States versus European style of policing and what we can learn from Europe's model of policing. So if you'd like to learn more information about that or to register for the event, please visit their website, which is upstateinternational.org. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. Hope you all have a great afternoon.